computer. Okay, so I'm going to count us in. 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Smedley, Acuity Associate, and welcome to the first of our spring webinars that aim to give you insight and understanding to navigate the many strategic and operational challenges that we're all facing at the moment. I'd also like to welcome Samantha McGrady, Director from DTP, who will be taking a look at what good risk management looks like now, some 5 years on probably from when the RSH first started to bang a drum on this issue. She'll also consider how the sector's risk map is changing given recent events. Before I hand over to Sam, some housekeeping issues. This webinar is scheduled to last for an hour. Sam's going to be taking questions at the end because I think there'll be in this particular presentation, there'll be a number of issues that her presentation will kind of cover in due course. So we'll get to the end and then we'll hoover up questions. So to pose your questions, please use the Q&A tool, which is at the bottom of your screen on the top toolbar there. Don't use the chat facility because it doesn't lend itself to this kind of format quite so well. Excuse me. So if you could just post a kind of a brief and succinct, to the point question for Sam, I'll be sifting through those at the end and putting them to Sam verbally. We are recording this, so it will be available for posterity for you to refer back to, and also for you to point out to your colleagues who couldn't actually make this webinar. That will be available on our website shortly after we finish, along with Sam's slides. So, without further ado, over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Steve, and good morning, everyone. I hope that you can now see my screen that I am sharing with my slides. I think Steve can give me a thumbs up if that's all working okay now. Fantastic. Okay, so thank you first of all to Acuity for asking me to come along and talk to the members today. As the opening slide says, and as Steve has said, this is all about risk, and it's taken a sort of a 2022 look at risk. So what I'm going to cover, I can get my button to work, right. I'll very, very briefly just introduce DTP, and some of you will be familiar with us, others perhaps less so, and then just do a little bit of context about why risk is important and why we should really be focusing on it now in 2022, perhaps even more so than at any other time, although I've said that many times over the last few years. I'm then going to take a look at some key aspects of risk management. So starting with the regulator's sector risk profile, the most recent one, and then how that then informs risk registers and assurance mapping and risk appetite. So some of those tools which hopefully will be familiar to you, certainly familiar terms, and how those are best used to inform good risk management. I'll then just have a little look at linking risk management to decision making, and then the sort of key roles and responsibilities of board, etc. within the organisation. So I anticipate talking for probably about 25 minutes, give or take. So I think there should be plenty of time for a discussion, questions and answers at the end of that. So DCP, we're a management consultancy. We've been going now for whatever that is, 16 years. We work almost exclusively in the social housing sector, working with housing providers like yourselves, and indeed we may well have worked with some of you who are on the webinar today. We do a bit of work with some other organisations, but where we do, those are linked into the sector. And we're all about wanting to help organisations improve and consequently then deliver better services to their customers. We're not a big organisation. We have a core team of 14 at the moment, and we also have some specialist associates for some of the more technical aspects of what the sector is required to do. This is just a screenshot from our website, which obviously you're free to go and have a look at, but it gives you a little indication of the kinds of things that we do. A lot of finance, treasury work, but other stuff as well. And I sit more on the non-finance side of things, so strategy, governance, etc. And I've been with DTP for about 6.5 years now. Always worked in the sector, right from sort of being a door-to-door rent collector when I walked the walk, up till now being a consultant where I talk the talk. So done everything really. And at DTP, I do specialise in regulatory compliance, governance and risk. I also do work on value for money, strategy development, and to some extent, yeah, whatever it is that that clients like to throw at me to help them with. Helpfully, I sit on the Regulator of Social Housing's advisors panel, represent DTP on that. So it gives us a good into what's happening in terms of the regulatory side of things, in terms of risk. And I also sit on the Institute of Housing's Policy Advisory Committee. So that's another good, useful source of intelligence. So a sense of urgency. Why risk management? Why are we talking about it now? Well, there's a number of reasons there that I've put at the top of that slide about why it should be at the top of your agenda and your board agenda at the moment. COVID hasn't gone away, Grenfell hasn't gone away, and we are now starting to see some of the knock-on impacts of Grenfell with the social housing white paper and legislation starting to be laid down in terms of changes to regulation. We've also got the post-Brexit impacts now really starting to hit home, and just to add even yet another layer, we have a war in Europe, as you know. We've got significant economic concerns, cost of living crisis, a lot of these terms that are bandied about, but when you do stop and think about them, you know, supply chains, etc., they produce a raft of risks to the sector as a whole, but risk to individual organisations as well. And just to top it all, there is a huge regulatory focus on risk. And yes, I appreciate that most of you on this webinar may be somewhat under the radar in terms of your engagement with the regulator, certainly in terms of IDA, of in-depth assessment, but nevertheless, it is good business practice and the regulator expects it anyway. And I'll talk a little bit more about regulatory expectations in a minute. But I think as well as that operating context, it's also the nature of the sector. The sector's really diversified in the last sort of probably 10 years. And there is a huge pressure to build new homes, but also increasingly massive pressure to invest in existing homes for building safety, fire safety reasons, but also the elephant in the room that's coming down the road, probably faster than some of us would like to think, which is the net zero carbon agenda. And all of these things bring new and indeed heightened risks. A risk that I think is often overlooked, but which the regulator is extremely focused on, is reputational risk. And that cuts across pretty much everything that you will do, whether it's building new homes, whether it's looking after your current tenants and getting the repair service right, whether it's providing care and support services. It's a whole bunch of things will impact on your reputational risk. So in my view, boards should absolutely be on top of all of this, the operating context and what that means for risk, because it's a key element of good governance. And what the board needs is good information and reporting through from officers. Risk management needs to be embedded throughout the organisation. This is not an add-on, this is something that everybody has a role to play in. And I think, again, something that is sometimes overlooked, but it's becoming increasingly important in the sector is risk appetite. And I am going to talk a little bit about what that means and how you should be dealing with it and using it. So, yeah, the wider operating environment, I've touched on some of this already, but I mean, we cannot ignore the current economic situation and what that means for you as organisations, as social businesses, but also as landlords, and even more importantly, what that means for your tenants. And I've just listed some of the things there that are starting to impact. And we add into that COVID, which has not gone away, lots and lots of absence at the moment, creating job vacancies, creating hitches in service delivery right across a whole number of sectors, and an awful lot of vulnerable people still who probably feel uncomfortable because the world has now opened up again, or certainly the UK has, and that there seemed to be no provision for them, no protection, and a lot of those people may well be your customers, your tenants. I've mentioned the war in Ukraine and the impacts there, and Brexit. If we just look at a couple of numbers, I think the economic growth predictions have now been significantly reduced by the government and the Office for Budget Responsibility, and indeed the ONS, all of these organisations that look at these things. So that's not a good place for the UK to be, and probably the most significant factor for you, and which is then impacting on a lot of those things in the slide, in the bullet points above, is inflation. And we are potentially looking at double figure inflation later this year, which is almost unheard of, I think, in probably in most of our lifetimes. So really, really significant. And linked to that, I've mentioned jobs, but also a fall in real wages. And I know that this has been a tussle for organisations, for boards in sort of annual pay rises, etc., for staff, as well as the tussle around, how much should we put the rents up by, and the private side of things in terms of housing, huge hikes in house prices, but also in private rents as well, and that then produces risks and impacts for our sector. So coming a bit closer to home, I've mentioned some of this already, but not all of it. Levelling up just seems to be a term, doesn't it? It doesn't really feel like very much is changing at the moment, but perhaps it's early days. So, we do need to keep a watching brief on that, depending on how we think it might impact us from a risk perspective. A couple of other things to pick out. If you're involved in the homelessness side of things, you will have seen that will be increasing now as the various provisions that were put in place for COVID ended, well, some time ago now, in fact. Something I haven't mentioned, but which the regulator is very, very cited on at the moment, as are those organisations which have been hit by this, is cyber security and cyber management. So there is a whole bunch of new standards, which I don't pretend to understand, but there is, around regulation, etc., but also a massively increased threat, and a number of housing providers have been targeted through ransomware attacks, and the regulator is very, very cited on that. I think the other thing for providers at the moment is this business of strategic choices. So how much of your sort of finite pot of money are you going to spend on the different calls on you, all of which I have mentioned, but which again are listed there? How are you deciding? What are the trade-offs? What are the options that the board is considering, and how do you decide how you divvy up that pot of money? Building new homes I've mentioned, and as with investing in existing stock. So the macroeconomic, the macro context, operating context is very, very much linked into housing and into our sector. So very briefly, regulation, there we have the Governance and Financial Viability Standard. Risk is not in the title, but it is very clear as you work through the standard of what the expectations are from the regulator around having an effective risk management and internal controls assurance framework. And there again, it's mentioned in the specific expectations around business planning, risk and control framework. And again, it happens to be approved by the board, and you need to be reviewing its effectiveness at least once a year. So those are the key bits from regulation. If we have a quick look at the Nhf Code of Governance, the 2021, which lots of organisations have now signed up to, there is a whole section on risk under Principle 4, Control and Assurance, which I'm not going to go through now, but the point is that this is high on the agenda from a governance perspective. And it's also noted in Principle 3, Board Effectiveness, around the functions of the board. And I am going to talk a little bit later on towards the end about the role of the board in all of this. So the starting point for any kind of assessment of risk should be the regulator's sector risk profile. That's where you should start. And what I've listed here on this slide and the next one, so it is over 2 slides, just to try and make it sort of big enough to read and take in, is taken directly from the latest sector risk profile, which came out towards the end of 2021. And interestingly, to look at those strategic risks, which I think in previous years, some of those may well have been judged to be operational risks. So access to labour and skills is now a key strategic risk from the regulator's perspective in our sector, as is counterparty risk. So the contractors that you engage with to do your repairs, services, build new homes, deliver support and care, those kinds of things. The reputational risk is up there, unsurprisingly. As I said, the regulator is very focused on it. The value for money risk, which is very much around that strategic choices piece that I mentioned earlier, and diversification, which is why I sort of laboured a little bit on that. And then a range of operational risks, and these are divided up. So on this slide, you've got the ones around existing stock and service delivery, and you'll hopefully a lot of these will be familiar to you. They will be risks that you will be aware of. I've mentioned sort of rent setting. I've mentioned delivering services to tenants, all the cost and inflation stuff, health and safety. Data's in there, and you'll see it's not just data security, which I've touched on, but also data integrity. And we know that this is a big one for the regulator also at the moment. Operational risks from a development perspective and finance and treasury, and these are unchanged from the previous year, but the point is that they are still there. And whilst these will not apply to every organisation, some of them will apply to some of you without a doubt. And they're probably things that you would not be surprised to see there around borrowing and around sort of construction and fraud and pensions. So that's your starting point. And the first thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the tools for effective risk management is risk registers. So every organisation should have a risk register, and usually, unless you're incredibly small, you would probably want to have a strategic risk register and an operational. So I'll just run through what those are. Your strategic risk register should directly link into your corporate or strategic plan, and you should be very much focused around what are the key risks to delivery of your purpose and your objectives. So what is it that you've said in that corporate plan that you are going to do, and what are the risks to being able to be successful and to achieve the delivery of those objectives. So I would always take the sector risk profile as your starting point and have a look and say, right, there's the sector risk profile, there's our corporate objectives, where do the two meet? And let's start with those as our key risks. But then it's also really important then to move on and focus on your own operating environment, whether that's a regional context, whether that's a geography or a size context, whether it's about the kinds of services and the kind of operation that you've got, and start to then bespoke your list of risks. I think with a strategic risk register, it is about keeping it high level. It should be the top risks. You do not want 50 risks in a strategic risk register. You should probably have somewhere between 10 and 15. And they are the absolute key core risks to delivery of your purpose. And those are the things that the board really, really needs to be focused on, because those are the things that can effectively make or break the organisation and the delivery of your purpose. However, we know that there are lots more risks that organisations have, and therefore quite often you may well also want to have an operational risk register, and you could have more than one of these, because some organisations divvy them up into the different service streams. So you may want to have one around customer service and everything that goes into that. You may want to have one around repairs. You may want to have one around finance. So, but these are the risks that sit below the top strategic risks, but which are nevertheless important, and they are things that you want to be keeping a close eye on, because moving to the next bullet, risks can move between the two. And when I was talking through the sector risk profile, I gave a couple of examples there of where perhaps in previous years you might have thought, well, that's a very operational risk. but actually the operational has become the strategic. And I think if we take something like day-to-day repairs services, this is something that the regulator has identified as something which has moved from the operational to the strategic. And that's not just because of new legislation around building and fire safety. It's because of the operational environment. It's because of cost inflation. It's because of supply chain issues, labour issues. What's the latest thing? Is it plasterboard? Is it cement? What is it? Was it bricks? What is it that we just can't get hold of? And where we can, we're paying 30 to 40% more than we were before. So, what is that doing at a strategic level, now that it's become a strategic risk, to your budgets and your business plans? So you can see that risks can move between the two. So it's really important to be focused on them both. You can also have a project risk registers, and these are perhaps more for organizations that are larger, but also it could apply to a smaller organization where you are very focused on a particular activity. And it could be something like borrowing, refinancing, getting some more money in to build new homes. And you might want to have a list there of some specific risks to that project, which are going to be time limited, but which nevertheless, because they're specific to that activity, you really want to keep a close eye on for a period of time. Generally, once you've identified your risk, the next step is to do that evaluation. And most people use a scoring mechanism. So it's the likelihood of the risk occurring. And then if it does occur, what's the impact? And you would give a score. You can use whatever scoring mechanism you like. I think most organizations either use out of 4 or out of 5. There's no right or wrong answer. You give each of those a score, the likelihood and the impact, and then you would basically combine the two, you multiply them to give you a gross risk. So that's the risk if you do absolutely nothing at all. That's the risk score that you've got. What you then do is apply your mitigations and controls and rescore the risk to give you what's known as a residual risk or a net risk. So once you've done everything that is within your control and power to manage and mitigate that risk, what's that score coming out at? And then the other score that lots of organizations are now applying is a target risk, and this links to your risk appetite. So your gross risk might be quite high, your managed or residual or net risk should be lower, but actually, is it where you really want it to be? And that's where it links to your risk appetite. And I'll say a bit more about that in a couple of minutes. And then all of that should be regularly updated. It should be the risk register, looking at risk, looking at emerging risk, looking at risk scoring, should really be something that the senior team is looking at on a pretty regular basis, but also that's being reported through to board. And if you have an audit committee, and I know that not all organizations do it if you're quite small, but if you do, then clearly they have a big role to play in this. So these might not be that clear to look at, but obviously when we make the slides available afterwards, you can sort of pan in on this and have a bit of a better look. But these are just a couple of two different examples of how you might lay out a risk register. You've probably all got a risk register, and so you might look at some of this and think, well, yeah, that's pretty similar to ours. But I supply them simply to give you a bit of a flavour of what others in the sector are doing, and there might be bits in there that you think, oh yeah, it might be quite useful for us to put that into ours. You'll see the second one, the one at the bottom half of the slide, includes the 3 lines of assurance, which I'm going to talk about as well. And some organisations are sort of merging their risk register with their assurance mapping to put it all in one place. But I'll talk again a little bit about assurance mapping in a sec. Well, now in fact. So assurance kind of sits alongside. I'm not going to say a lot about assurance because there is another Acuity webinar coming up in the next few weeks, which is going to be focusing on assurance. So I'm not going to go into any great detail on this, but it suffice to say that it should sit alongside your risk management. And the general approach in the sector is to have the 3 lines of defence. So yeah, I did have a slide actually with a table in, but I've taken it out because I think Steve thought I had too many slides. So I'll just try and talk to this one. So your starting point for your first line of defence is your risk control. So this is what you do internally. It's your own internal controls, how you operate, it's your sort of policies and procedures, and that will give you the first line of control, if you like, over your risks and assurance. Your second line of defence is your risk management, and this generally comes from the senior team. So it's going to be, you know, how are you reporting through? What are your compliance functions looking like? What's your performance around sort of you know, service delivery, financial performance, etc.? How is that looking? Have you got the right staff in place? What kind of feedback are you getting from the end users, if you like, of your various services? So again, it's an internal line of defence, but it's at a wider level, a higher level, a broader level. And then your final line of defence is around your assurance, and this is usually independent external assurance. So your two different kinds of audit. Obviously, external audit is focusing on the financial side of things. Internal audit will be focusing more on a whole raft of activity that you do, are you implementing your policies as you should be, etc. But also where you use external advice. That could be legal advice. It could be a consultant giving you a review of governance, for example, or of effectiveness, something like that. It could be a specialist health and safety advisor that you've called in to do a bit of an audit. So that's where you're getting your third line of defence. And for each risk that you've got in your risk register, your strategic risk register at least, you should be trying to apply the three lines of defence and seeing if there are any gaps. So I won't say any more about assurance because, as I say, it's going to be covered in a future webinar, but I think it's important to have it in your toolbox as one of your tools around risk management. So risk appetite, and I think this is something that's really crept up the agenda in the sector and is now something that the regulator would certainly be very cited on, but which, frankly, even if they weren't, again, it's a bit like a lot of the things I've talked about today. It's just good business practice to be doing these things. So your risk appetite, and this is kind of, you know, what does good look like in the sector? You would basically assess your appetite for risk against each of your strategic risks, or you might want to group some of those risks just to make it a bit simpler and a bit easier. And the kind of wording that is generally used in the sector for your appetite is those five that I've listed there. So averse, cautious, balanced, open, and hungry. But it's not just about giving each one a name. It's really important to have the supporting narrative against each one to explain what the appetite is and explain why you, in your particular situation, you have set that appetite. So the simplest way of doing it is just to define the current appetite. But increasingly, we're seeing some organisations taking this to a next step, be a little bit more sophisticated in their approach to risk appetite, which could include a direction of travel. So it may be, for example, take something like development. At the minute, we're kind of balanced in our approach to development. And part of the reason for that is, you know, we are mindful of the operating environment, we're mindful of the counterparty risk, we're mindful of, you know, what the borrowing situation might look like. But in an ideal world, we want to move towards being open or hungry for development, because that's you know, it's one of the reasons we exist. We want to provide more new homes to meet housing need. It's part of our purpose, etc. So you could include that. And then we're starting also to see a few organisations set in what we call a risk appetite tolerance, which isn't that common in the sector really, but it's just something that I flag up there so that you're aware that it's something that organisations are doing. And I think the early warning triggers are important because clearly when you're looking at risk, if something is starting to move out of risk appetite or it's kind of in the amber area, you need to be aware of that, and your board may well then need to be aware of that. And the question there is it's moving out of risk appetite. Is there anything we can do to bring it back into risk appetite, or is our risk appetite wrong? Given the operating environment, given what's changing, and do we need to then go back and look at it again? So those triggers are important part of how you deal with your risk appetite. The board has to approve your risk appetite statement, and you should use it to inform decision making, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in a second. I think it's really important that you kind of future-proof it. You really want to enable a sort of agile culture. What you don't want is to have a risk appetite that was set, 2-3 years ago, and you're absolutely bound by it. You can't, you're tied in, you can't use it in an agile way to enable you to take opportunities that might come along and to take a few more risks within a managed way. So reviewing your risk appetite on a pretty regular basis, annually, I would say at least, and perhaps more than that if there is a major issue or a major event that impacts on you. But as I also say, don't overcomplicate it. And in many ways, it's no different to your own personal appetite for risk, in other walks of life. So that's just a table just to give you an idea about what a sort of very basic standard sector approach might be to mapping that risk appetite. But as I say, what you would have then sitting alongside that is some narrative. So why, if we take technological risk, why are we open to that? Why have we decided that for us, we want to be open? Why are we hungry when it comes to building new homes? And why have we got very minimal approach to risk when it comes to condition of homes, for example? I mean, some of it's obvious: health and safety, legal compliance, etc. You want to be taking a more reverse or minimal approach for sure, but it's still important to set that out. And then you need to use your risk appetite. So the question is, what is it that you want to be? What does your strategic vision, purpose say that you want to be? And the question then is, how much risk are you prepared to tolerate to get there, to achieve that? And you should be using your risk appetite most for making decisions. So if you're a board, or indeed if you're in the senior team and you've got an opportunity, what is it that you're being asked to do, or what's being recommended, or what is it that you're thinking of doing? Where does it sit within that stated risk appetite? And if it's outside of your risk appetite, the two questions that I posed before, is it the wrong thing to be doing? Is it the wrong decision because it's just too far out your risk appetite and therefore you don't want to go there? Or is the risk appetite wrong? And I think those are the kinds of questions that executives and boards need to be asking themselves. When you're producing board papers, or if you're a board member, when you're receiving a board paper, you should really have, if it's for making a decision, there should be an element in there around, where does this decision sit within risk appetite, both our tolerance, but also our target. Boards should be seeking assurance on this from the executive, but board members should also be challenging each other. This isn't just about challenging the staff. It's about challenging each other, asking the right questions, because on something that appears to be really exciting, a really innovative project, it is easy to get carried away. And what you want on a board or in a senior team is people who are, enthusiasts, innovators, wanting to push the envelope, but you also need people who are going to sort of be a bit more cautious, ask the right questions, challenge each other, so that ultimately you can come to the right decision, being guided by your risk appetite. You can also use your risk appetite in task and finish groups. I think I mentioned earlier, you might set one up, for example, if you were going to do a new borrowing exercise, but there could be other things where you want to just guide a specific activity around the risk appetite. And the staff, as I said, need to be mindful of it, not only when preparing board papers, but also if there are delegated decisions that the senior team are allowed to take, they should also not be ignoring the stated risk appetite in that particular area. So some of this I've covered, and I'm going to kind of speed through because we're getting towards the end of the time that I said I would speak for. So board papers for decisions, not only about should they include risk appetite, but they should absolutely have a section on the risk, the strategic risk, the risk implications, and what the impact would be. So what are the risks in the decision? Where do they feature in your risk register? Where do they link through to your corporate strategic plan? And where, in fact, does that risk sit within the organisation? Because that's quite important. Reference to risk appetite, as I've said, and boards really, really do need to be referencing risk when they are making decisions, really, really thinking about what are the trade-offs, what are the implications, accepting inherent risks. And equally, you can use that risk assessment to decide not to do something. So, you can use it to make a decision, but being fully aware of the risks and how you are planning then to manage and mitigate them. But also you may decide, actually, the risks here are too great and it's too far outside our risk appetite, so we're not going to do it. Role of the board, I think I've covered a lot of this, absolutely is in charge and must be leading on this and is ultimately responsible for risk management. And that's clear from regulation, from governance, from just generally just setting strategic direction. Should be identifying new risks, challenging existing risks, understanding where the impact lies, seeking assurance, identifying its risk appetite, as I've said, getting regular updates, and you should really have risk as a standard agenda item. If not for every board meeting, I would suggest minimum twice a year, ideally 4 times a year. And again, I know a lot of you won't be getting an IDA from the regulator, but that would be a regulatory expectation if you were. If you have an audit committee, and I know you don't all, but the point here is that it's an independent advisor to the board around risk management. It can dig deep, it can skim over, it can focus on the key risks, it can put more time in to risk management than the board often has time for. Really importantly, it needs to ensure that risks are fully reflected in the internal audit plan that you produce every year, and that's really important. And it can also commission additional external detailed work on risks where it feels that it's necessary. So not only doing its own deep dive, but bringing in an external expert to assist with that. So it needs to add value to the board's work on risk, but the board cannot delegate the responsibility for risk to an audit committee. And then finally, the senior team, the senior staff. And again, I think I've touched on a lot of this. This is very much about taking responsibility as a senior team for risk management, but also making sure that the board is getting what it needs on risk management, providing that assurance and embedding that culture of risk management, that everybody has a role to play in risk management. It's well understood, I think, across the sector, but putting it into practice is something that is perhaps not always quite so easy to do. One way of doing that is to make risk management a key aspect of the performance management framework in the sector, in the organisation, sorry, and making sure that it therefore gets that focus. So I'm going to stop there. I will stop sharing and hand back to Steve, who hopefully will have some exciting questions.
Thanks, Sam. Again, I think that was really comprehensive and tons of really useful practical pointers for people there to kind of smarten up their approach to risk management. So thanks for that. I'll just remind people that we've got the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can jot down your brief and to the point questions that I can put to Sam. Whilst you're thinking about that, I've got a few questions myself. Sam, you mentioned in the context of risk appetite that you can set your triggers and thresholds. Can you give us some practical examples of what you mean? I should imagine it's with financial stuff, it's probably stuff like gearing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think some of it you would be doing anyway, because they're your kind of golden rules around your financial management. And I think most organizations would be doing that. But I think there are other examples. So if I give you an example, say that you're developing housing for sale, and it could be shared ownership, it doesn't have to be outright sale. You may have a risk appetite which says that you want, at any one time, you want 0 properties that are ready but haven't been sold, but you might set a trigger at, I don't know, 10 properties or 20 properties, depending, a certain proportion of the properties that you're developing, and that would then set a trigger at which point you would start to say, hang on a minute, this isn't looking too good. We've had 10 shared ownership properties that have been ready for 6 months. And nobody seems to want them. What do we need to do? Do we need to have a sales push? Do we need to look again at whether shared ownership is the right model for those particular properties. So what the trigger should do is to give you an early warning that something's not going in the right direction in terms of your risk appetite, and then give you the opportunity to do something about it. I mean, obviously other examples could be around, I mean, I mentioned health and safety. Again, you're probably going to have a zero tolerance risk appetite for having any kind of outstanding gas servicing, electrical inspections, those kinds of things. But you might set a trigger that was, again, a certain percentage that were perhaps, out of date or incomplete. And again, what that's doing is that is then just giving you the opportunity to take some remedial action before things get so bad that, you're into kind of, self-referring or, God forbid, any kind of like health and safety executive type reporting or incident or anything like that. So it's about setting a trigger or an alert that's early enough to allow you to take some mitigating action, but that's not too far down the line whereby, you've almost kind of blown it and there's not a lot that you can do.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we've got a question in from David Nugent, I think, they're in Yorkshire. I would remind everyone, do use that Q&A function to post your questions. So David's just saying, how do we prevent ourselves being hoisted by our own petard if assessing our risk appetite as hungry? He thinks that most boards will be cautious when setting risk appetite to avoid ringing alarm bells with the regulator. So yeah, I guess, is there a point where, is there almost like an expectation that we don't take too many risks in the sector?
Well, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? And I think the regulator has been criticised over the years for perhaps giving mixed messages on some of this, because if you don't set a sort of perhaps a more ambitious risk appetite, say for building new homes, you could be accused then of not sweating your assets and just sitting on the cash and that kind of thing. So it is a dilemma, because clearly then if you go too far that way, you end up risking your own viability and that kind of thing. Which is why I think when you are assessing your risk appetite, it's really important to divvy it up between the different things that you do as an organization, rather than just having one overarching, our risk appetite is cautious. That's not nuanced enough, I don't think, for the nature of housing associations. You do lots of different things, and therefore sitting back, taking some time to think about, like the example that I gave there, when it comes to customer service delivery, where do we sit? When it comes to financial management, where does our appetite sit? When it comes to building new homes, where does our appetite sit? So I think that the regulator expects you to take that nuanced approach, to be honest. I think that at the moment, I think the regulator is very, very alive to the risks, the increased enhanced risks around building new homes, to do with a lot of the stuff that I talked about supply chains, about costs, and about delays, about not being able to get the labour on site, and that's even after all the COVID related delays that we have had. So I believe that the regulator is aware of all of that and understands it, and therefore there may therefore be an expectation that you perhaps do pull back on your development risk appetite, just using that as an example, perhaps a little than perhaps what you might have been at, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago, when we seem to be in a much more kind of benign operating environment, pre-COVID, some of the economic shocks that we're experiencing at the moment, which is why it's important, as I say, to keep your risk appetite under review. It can't be static.
And so I guess going back to David's question, if to avoid being hoisted by your own petard, whether you're too hungry or too, I forget what the other end of the spectrum was, meek or something.
Averse,
that's it. I suppose you could be criticised anyway and hoisted by those particular petards, but I think it probably comes down to the narrative that you had in your box, your justification.
Yeah.
So if you've got a compelling and plausible justification in your little narrative box, I would have thought any regulator, even if you were going to get an IDA, isn't going to second guess the board there if it's compelling enough.
Yeah, that's right. And it isn't for the regulator or any external body to tell the board what its risk appetite should be. That absolutely is a responsibility of the board. The point is that the board needs to be able to explain and justify it, which is why the narrative is really, really important. And, you know, I said keep it simple, which is why I showed the matrix and the sort of, you know, the 5 categories. And I think that that is absolutely where organizations should start from. But then you need to add in that additional context narrative beneath that to be able to explain why for you have decided that in this particular area, your risk appetite is X and what that means. So giving some examples, I think, is quite important in that narrative, because then when you come to use your risk appetite, when you're having to make some tricky decisions, or you're having to assess options around, are we going to use some money for X, Y, or Z? That's the reminder about why you set your risk appetite like that. You know, and to then inform that decision, rather than kind of scratching your head and going, oh, why on earth did we say that we were hungry on that? You know, it doesn't feel right in the context of this decision. If you've put that narrative in, then you will remember why. And then you can use that to inform it.
And just briefly, before we get to Funke's question, just picking up this David's issue again. I mean, listening to you speak and go through the sector risk profile and with reference to David's question, it just seems to me that for well over a decade now, we've been told that the sector is facing unprecedented risks. So every year passes and we have even more unprecedented risks than the year before. Is there a risk, I suppose, that after all of this, and the icing on the cake is Brexit supply issues, war in Ukraine supply issues, we're just about to face an inflationary time bomb where a lot of our tenants are probably going to struggle to pay their rent? Is there a risk that the sector just says, these risks are all too huge, all so diverse, is almost impossible to navigate a way through because they're coming at us? You know, some of these things are possibly unquantifiable at the moment. Just how bad is inflation going to be on our tenants? Is there a real risk that everybody just gets dazzled in the headlights, sits on their hands, and they all take all their risk maps down to, again, the averse? So nobody does anything.
It's certainly a risk, but I think, you know, what a good board would be doing is looking back and seeing what storms have we actually already weathered, where we thought it was, you know, the end of the world, in inverted commas, like say the 1% rent reduction for 4 years. Yeah, the whole sector threw their hands up in horror. But did we survive it? Did it go okay? Did anybody go under? You know, no. So I think looking back is always useful in terms of context, not too far, not ancient history, but looking back at what we have had to weather. But I think the other thing that, you know, that a good board would be doing is just, again, going back to purpose and mission and what is it that we are here to do, and, you know, not letting the organisation be blown off course by external events, you know, any more than perhaps, you know, it has to be. And though yeah, absolutely, there will be things that will, you know, make you veer perhaps off course a little bit, but not so widely off course. You know, the sector is really good at managing these external impacts and risks. You know, it's got a track record. So I think that, you know, a smart board, a smart set of staff can sit down and can work through these things. And yes, you might want to temper some of your ambition. And I think, you know, we are definitely seeing that, but certainly around them development plans, those are being tempered at the moment, but not forever. You know, people are looking at this in the sort of 1 to 2 year ahead category and sort of saying, okay, maybe, you know, we're not going to develop 200 new homes over the next 5 years, perhaps it's only going to be 100 or 150, but come the end of that period, we're back on track. We'll get out there, we'll get the money borrowed again, and we'll get building, because we expect that by then things will be an awful lot better. So I think it's about getting that kind of context, if you like, about this is not a forever situation. It's what do we do now in the short, hopefully only short term, perhaps a bit short to medium term, to manage things, but without throwing ourselves completely off course. Because if we're not going to do the things that we said that we exist to do, then what's the point, in existing, in just kind of, putting our head down and, just being scared, as it were. So I think the good boards, the good organizations will see it for what it is, manage it well, but we'll come out the other end of it, as the sector always generally does, in pretty good shape.
Brilliant. Well, that's reassuring. I was starting to panic a bit there, with the overall risk map. Right, so Funke's question is just basically, are organisations required to maintain an operational risk register in addition to the strategic risk register? And obviously this is all an issue of proportionality for smaller organisations.
No, there's no requirement at all to have both. It's really about, it's about two things. It is about size of your operation, definitely. But I also think that where size isn't perhaps a driving factor, it is about what it is that you are doing. So how complicated is your business? What kinds of different services are you delivering, and at what different levels? And might it therefore make sense to have those risks divided into something that's very strategic, that you would want the board to be looking at most of its meetings, but then something that's quite operational sitting below that. So there's no requirement. It's about, to some extent, a personal preference for how you want to deal with, manage, report on, oversee risk within your organization. But I think it can be impacted by, what exactly is it that you are doing as an organization, and how complicated is it? And, there's a danger if you say we're just going to have one risk register, that it just gets too packed with too much stuff, and then you can kind of lose the wood for the trees, sort of thing. So I think that's the other thing to think about, is simplicity.
And I guess at the end of the day, if you wanted to keep everything very, very light touch, it could almost be part of the way that senior managers are performance managed. At the end of the day, a chief exec could actually say, as part of the performance management for the top team, within your domain, I'd like you to just identify what the 3, 4, 5 key risks are. That's your job. It's your domain. You tell me what your 3, 4, 5 key risks are, and we'll revisit that every time we have a one-to-one, or we're having a bit of a chat about things, or even an ops team meeting or something like that. No, I think risks should be on the agenda for one-to-ones, but also for teams, for teams, because that responsibility cascades all the way through an organization in terms of being responsible for risks. And it's not just about, well, we've identified these are our risks, what are we doing about them? Are we still keeping them under control? It's about, really understanding your experience of that risk. So actually, since we last talked about it, have we started to experience this risk in a more significant way? Has the likelihood increased? Or is it that if this risk were now to materialize because of what's happening externally, the impact is going to potentially be bigger. So it's challenging yourselves on that, but it's also keeping that weather eye on what's coming around the corner in terms of emerging risks. And there is a role for everybody in the organisation on that. That is not just something that the board or a committee needs to be doing. It's for everybody. And often a team, which is far closer to what's going on out there, is actually better placed in a lot of ways to identify emerging risks. So I think it's really, really important that this is something that is discussed on a reasonably regular basis, both with individuals in terms of one-to-ones, etc., but also in a team environment, and teasing out from people what's actually going on out there,
so that you've got very early sight on something that may become what could be actually quite a big risk. Even if it doesn't, even if it just becomes a small risk, you still want to know about it and you still want to be doing something about it.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Well, guys, we've still got a few minutes if you want to post your questions. I'm assuming there aren't so many because Sam's been so comprehensive and preempted them. But yeah, I just want to revisit that weather eye on risks around the corner. And I touched on it before, which is the impact of inflation on tenants. I was just wondering if you've picked anything up from the sector at all about the extent to which this is now starting to figure on people's risk maps, and are they coming up with any smart ways of preempting it, dealing with it, mitigating it?
I think it is starting to feature more in that people being more alive to the potential around rental income. So I think ability to pay rent. I think there was a feeling when we went into the pandemic, sort of just over 2 years ago, that rent arrears might be an issue, and in actual fact, it turned out to just not be. I think because of the nature of furloughing and all the sort of financial support and safety nets that were put in place, most organisations, I think, actually saw a reduction in rent arrears. I think going forward now, I think we're in a different world, because I don't think it's the government's had the opportunity, didn't it, in its spring statement to put some measures in place around benefits and universal credit and things like that to help those most badly affected, the poorest, and didn't. So I think that we're looking at a rocky ride. So I think that, yes, organisations are starting now to perhaps make some less favourable assumptions around things like rental income and rent arrears. And I think what's also happening, and I'm seeing this in a lot of organisations, is boards saying, this isn't on, we need to be doing something about this, and quite significantly increasing things like hardship funds.
Yeah.
So yes, it's reactive, and yes, it's not what you could say, well, perhaps it's not what the sector should be doing, this is the role of government, etc. But faced with a government that clearly isn't going to do anything about it, I think there's a real sense amongst a lot of boards that they want to kind of jump in and say, we want to try and help. And I think the other thing that's really, really going to be a massive thing for the sector in 6 months' time is what next April's rent increase is going to look like. It's gonna, it was. I think a lot of organisations found it hard this year to go for that 4.1%, but everybody has. I think if you're looking at something that's in double figures, I just don't think it's going to be tenable. And so what are organisations going to do? What are those discussions, options, trade-offs, all of that kind of thing? What's that going to look like for boards? I think that's going to be a really big risk issue that's coming down the road in this financial year that boards are going to have to be sighted on.
Right. Well, I think we're almost up to our allotted time. So I think I'm going to call it at this point. Thanks again, Sam, for a really comprehensive and actually quite practical discussion that I really hope will help people smarten up their approach to risk management. I'll just simply flag to everyone once again that this has been recorded. It will be available on the website for you to refer back to, and to also signpost to your colleagues who couldn't make it. Sam's slides will also be available. This is only the first of 5 that are currently planned. There's probably another one going to come on stream as well. And again, we're going to kind of revisit this topic slightly, but zoom in more on what a good assurance framework looks like. So that's coming up as well. We've also got a policy session with the Nhf a bit later this week. And yeah, we're even going to be looking at ESG, environmental, social and governance type metrics at a future webinar with HouseSmart. So we've got lots on. Do check our website, get yourself signed up for the other webinars. That's it from me. Hopefully I'll see you at a future one. And again, Sam, thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.